start on there. So the session's now being recorded. So before we start, I just wanted to explain the session in a bit more detail. So we have up to an hour. We will definitely keep to schedule. We may actually run a little bit ahead of schedule, but what's most important is that we go through all the key aspects, but also that you have an opportunity for questions and answers as well. What I would say on the back of the questions and answers for anyone that's been on a training session that I've facilitated, GDPR is really important. So if you do have a question or a comment, obviously make sure that it's not identifiable to any individual. But also as well, it's possible to ask me after the session. So it may well be that there's Q&A that perhaps sits outside of the session, and obviously just give me a call, drop me a line. I'll hang around after the session as well, and just ask me any questions that you might have there as well. I'm going to start sharing my screen before I go into the next section there. Now, what that will mean is that I'm going to lose eye contact in terms of identifying hands that may go up. So the suggestion is, I think that we'll go through the session, but obviously if there are questions that you have, please make a note. Just make a note of them, and obviously that way there's an opportunity towards the end of the session, and I'll come off sharing the screen, and then we can go through any of those that you may have. It's the good old thing of sharing presentations. You kind of lose all the visual, it just disappears really. So I'm going to attempt to do that now, so just bear with me 2 moments, and I will then do it on to Okay, can somebody come off mute and just let me know whether you can see this?
Yeah, it's there.
Fantastic, thank you so much, thank you. So, moving on to the next session, before we start to go through anything at all, I just wanted to explain really more the overarching approach. So there are 2 main aspects to this that bridge across several policies and procedures that they have. So the first one is really recognising that there is a need for balance between work and family life. The second aspect around this is recognition that employees will need time away for family responsibilities from time to time. So those family-friendly policies apply to everyone, and they apply to everyone regardless of kind of your contract type or anything like that at all. It's universal. What we're going to typically cover today is maternity leave, paternity leave, adoption leave, parental leave, and shared parental leave as well. For 2 reasons, partly because they are some of the more frequent scenarios that may arise, but equally some of them are less well known. So there's an opportunity here to hopefully bridge any kind of gaps in terms of understanding what it's about and what the process and entitlements are surrounding them. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other policies that connect with that. So, for example, we have the flexible working policy, we have the special leave policy and procedure. Obviously, they bridge a broader domain, so they're not just about family scenarios, but there is a link in. But obviously, with the amount of time that we have, obviously we've not got the capacity to go through it all. However, we are doing regular sessions. I think flexible working's already been covered, may well be covered in the future, similarly with special leave as well. So there are opportunities, and equally just give us a call, and obviously that's what we're there for within HR. So that's the framework of the session. So what we're going to do now is actually go through each in turn. So if you do have any questions, any observations, anything at all that you wanted to mention, please make a note, and obviously at the end of the session, obviously we've got that opportunity to then go through any aspects there. So we're going to start first and foremost with good old maternity leave. So I would imagine that from an employee perspective, and certainly from a manager perspective, maternity scenarios are going to be the most common scenario that you may come across. So therefore, some of which you may know already some of this, but there may actually be aspects as well that are new or perhaps less well known within that framework. And also as well, if HR in the future ever asks you a question about something, it might help just to link in terms of why we've asked that or sought clarity over something. Maternity leave, similar to what you'll see with other scenarios, you're going to see some commonality going across the 2. Predominantly because of the legal requirements. So there's a lot of kind of similar requirements and entitlements that bridge all of the different domains. The other thing I wanted to mention today as well is that obviously we're not going to go through absolutely everything in detail. Obviously that would take rather a long time. Obviously that would affect your concentration as well. So what I've actually done is homed in on the headlines. So really, what are the key aspects you need to know? That's not to say that there won't be other details that are relevant within this. So you may come across questions or scenarios that might be slightly different to the framework, but that's obviously what we're there for, alongside the policy, because the policy will talk more extensively about some of the details on entitlements and process. But maternity leave, similar to some of the other entitlements, is a day one right. So regardless of your length of service, every single employee has an entitlement to maternity leave of 52 weeks, and that spans across the board. There are requirements around notification, and one of the things that you'll see both in kind of some of the legal language and some of the policy language is some of the jargon that gets thrown in here. And I think the law has a very weird way of talking about deadlines and notification requirements. So the next bit here is a classic example of that, because it's about the employee notifying their line manager and completing a maternity application form. Ideally with the MAP-B1, we know there can be delays with the MAP-B1. That's absolutely fine. I think it's as soon as it's received, that needs to come through, because it's an important part of the confirmation from our end. And no later than the 15 weeks before the expected week of confinement. So the expected week of confinement is a very old traditional term. Essentially, we're talking about due date here, but legally, I think we've still got some old references to language in there. So essentially, ultimately, as long as an employee, now it may well be that you have notification way before that, and that's absolutely fine, but obviously there's a cut-off limit that an employee has to notify you. Within 28 days of the notice, what will then happen, so the application will come through to you, it'll also come through to HR. If everything's looking okay, we will then confirm out in writing. So that's a really, really important thing. And legally, we need to do that within 28 days. And that will confirm the dates. So this will feed off what's on the form in terms of the requested dates. The pay details will be within there. We'll talk about annual leave a little bit later as well, but it will also talk about things like maximum return dates as well. So that's an important, and you'll find that bridging across paternity leave, adoption leave, all the others. HR will always write out. The other aspect, which is really important as well, is the maternity risk assessment. So there is a link on the intranet, but if anybody ever gets stuck and they can't find it, obviously just drop us a line and we can signpost you to that. But it's really important that there is a risk assessment undertaken at that point. Clearly, everybody's situation is going to be different. So in some situations, it might be the nature of the role. Is there lone working? Is there manual handling? In other situations, it may be surrounding the individual and their own pregnancy and how that may be going. But that's an important part, just to have that check-in to make sure that we are following that duty of care. There's reasonable paid time off for antenatal care, so that's paid time. There is scope to ask for evidence, so it's nobody's doing anything wrong by asking that, but obviously there are judgment calls made by managers as to whether they want to do that, possibly particularly maybe after 1 or 2 appointments. And I think from an employee's perspective, it's about you're very much giving as much notice as possible, I guess, so that we can make sure that there's an operational coverage as well at the same time. Employees can commence employee maternity leave anytime from the 11th week before the due date. Typically, that tends not to be the case, but legally is allowed. What tends to happen, I think, from experience, is that the request tends to be to start mat leave as close to the due date as possible, or possibly with some annual leave tagged in before. That tends to be the common approach. And I think the reason for that is possibly to dip into annual leave, but also just maximise that 12 months leave. But technically, up to 11 weeks is permissible. And that can be done as well. Where possible, employees should take annual leave prior to taking maternity commencement. Now, what happens, sometimes this can be straightforward. Sometimes, dependent on the annual leave calendar, it can create a bit of a bottleneck, because if maternity starting perhaps very, I don't know, September, October, there's not going to be an opportunity to take a great deal of leave. Now, what can happen, and obviously this is subject to kind of agreement with the line manager in the normal way, so annual leave requests is very much part of the normal process, requesting ITRENT, everything that applies to everybody else. But sometimes what can happen is that there's agreement to take some annual leave prior to maternity start, or maybe tagging it on to the end. That sometimes is something that's requested. Anything not taken will be carried over, so it does slightly deviate from the 5-day carryover. So obviously there is that fuller carryover, but we do obviously encourage annual leave to avoid that bottleneck, and also from a duty of care, because sometimes it can help, particularly in the run up to the closeness of that due date as well. And that's something that can either be kind of prompted by yourselves as an employee, but equally as a manager as well. So it's something just to bear in mind when you're having those discussions at that time. Okay. Following on from that, so this is where we're going to start to talk about pay. Now, pay can go in about 2 or 3 different domains. So for those individuals who have less than 26 weeks service at the 15th week before the due date, essentially a fancy way, I think, of saying, I think broadly about 9 months before the due date, I think is how that generally plays out, or earns less than the lower earnings limit, won't be entitled to the ordinary maternity leave, but they may be entitled to a government maternity allowance. So there's a separate process and application for that. So that individual will receive financial support, but obviously it's sitting outside of what would be ordinary maternity pay. Employees that have been employed for 26 weeks service, again, applying that 15-week before the EWC, may be entitled to the contractual kind of ordinary maternity leave or statutory. So this goes back to 2 things. I haven't gone into huge details here because it's quite complicated. We've got quite a family of organisations within the university network. So part of it is driven by what's in the contract. Part of it is also driven by what's in the policy. So I would encourage you to have a look at the policy as well, because it does spell out all the different entitlements across the staffing side. But obviously that service history is important as part of that process. The other things, the 2 or 3 things that I wanted to just touch upon as well, are, it's not as common, but sometimes there can be pregnancy related illnesses in the run up to the maternity commencement, particularly in the kind of the 4th week before. If that happens, then maternity leave legally has to start the following day of the sickness. That's something that we keep an eye on, but it's something just to bear in mind as well, because that can bring forward the start of maternity leave. Keep in touch kit days. Obviously, we love lots of jargon. So keep in touch days are also probably, I'm hoping that they are quite familiar in terms of those terms, but actually it's important to mention them, because what they allow at any point during the maternity leave is an opportunity to dip in. So that could be for a training session. It could be to undertake some work and start to become more familiar with work, particularly in the run up perhaps to coming back. There's no obligation to take them, but if an employee does want to take them, they obviously need to get consent from their manager, and then there's a form that needs to come into HR to make sure that that's paid, because that is paid time. The only thing to bear in mind with that is that if an individual asks to work, say, a couple of hours, and use a kit day and you work a couple of hours, that constitutes 1 kit day legally. So that's eating into that 10 allowance. So the fact that it's a reduced number of hours won't stop that being constituting 1 day. The individual will be paid for the hours that they do, and obviously that has to be signed by the manager there. But sometimes I think they are starting to increasingly be used, and I think sometimes, particularly towards the latter part of maternity leave, can be quite a good way of kind of reintroducing and integrating back into the team. The other couple of bits in here, very, very rare, but I'm going to mention them anyway, but it's quite rare. Sometimes what can happen is an employee may have a view in terms of when they might want to end their mat leave. So that might be the full 12 months or slightly earlier. You can change your mind. So obviously, if somebody goes, well, actually, I was thinking about coming back on month 9, but I'm going to come back at month 12 now. You can do that. Equally, if somebody was originally intending to take 12 months and they want to come back early, they can do that as well. The key thing is about notice. So obviously there is a legal aspect around there, which we follow as well, which is this 8-week notice. That's also important as well, because if you have got cover in a role, obviously we've got a responsibility to whoever's doing backfill cover for that post, and we obviously need to give them due notice if there's going to be a change perhaps to the cover, or if you're going to seek to extend that cover, and go through the approval mechanisms for that as well. The university can also has the right to claim back the occupational element of the maternity pay if somebody chooses not to return to work or remain in employment for a period of 3 months. That is very, very rare for that to happen. But obviously there's a caveat built around that in terms of that expectation of return to work. The last thing I just wanted to mention on maternity before we move on to paternity leave is that we have recently developed a return from maternity form, which is channeled through the iTrent system. So that return to work, very similar to a sickness return to work in some regards, is just making sure that we are following our duty of care and that we are very mindful of any particular needs that an individual might have, whether that's on health or actually generally in terms of getting up to speed where things are at. So I think that return to work dialogue, which obviously then gets captured in the form, is really, really important, just to make sure that that person's fully supported on return to work, and that as a manager you have awareness of anything that you need to know about. Obviously the employee has a choice on what they share, of course they do, but as transparent as possible would be very helpful, because it's just about making sure that we kind of tailor that support as is needed, really. So that is the world of maternity. We're going to go on to paternity leave now. So what you'll also find in here, and you'll see me kind of talking about, is various scenarios. You'll see this when we start to go into shared parental leave as well, in terms of who is the partner, who is the primary carer, because dependent on how people are defined, or they define themselves, may impact where they fall under. So obviously if somebody's the primary person in terms of undertaking maternity leave and they have a partner, then that partner will fall under the paternity leave policy. So it's similar to the other areas, but I'll explain it more as we go through. So anybody falling under paternity leave can take either a single block of 1 or 2 weeks paid leave. Now, the law has recently changed. So there used to be a much reduced time for you to be able to take that leave. But now, I think it last year, the year before, it extended out to 12 months. So an individual no longer needs to feel that they need to take that leave very quickly. Typically, most situations they tend to be on the birth of the child or the placement of the child on adoption, but technically somebody has up to 12 months now to undertake that, so it provides a bit of space to do that. There are rules around this though, in the sense of that continuous employment requirement. So again, in terms of that, in continuous employment for 26 weeks, obviously it's the same statement as the kind of the maternity, or ending in the week max for adoption. And again, you need to be obviously have a responsibility for the upbringing of the child. For those individuals who may not qualify, what I would say is that doesn't mean to say that necessarily you can't take leave. But again, what it might be requiring is perhaps looking at annual leave or a different form of leave. And we're going to talk about parental leave and other forms in a moment. So it doesn't mean to say that that person can't take leave, but what it means is it's technically not under the paternity leave banner. What we also do is actually enhance the legal requirements. So we actually go beyond the statutory paternity pay, which mirrors, I think, the maternity pay. I could be wrong, but I think it mirrors the maternity pay. We actually pay normal pay. And I think that's the right thing to do. Some organisations don't do that. We feel it's the right thing to do, so there is no impact on pay. There is an application form process that goes with that as well, because obviously we need to make sure that payroll's aware. You will obviously see that first as managers. HR obviously will see that as well. And I'm jumping ahead. I know I'm jumping ahead on the screen there. We will also reply within 28 days. So that's a confirmation, obviously, of that paternity leave. So that's a standard part of what HR would do. There is also the right to take paid time off to attend 2 antenatal appointments, but obviously that needs approval as well from the line manager. You can also subsequently change the timing, but obviously due notice needs to be given. I think that was a new thing written into the law as well. So paternity leave is quite contained, but obviously if you do come across situations where perhaps yourselves as individuals or as managers have situations where perhaps that person doesn't meet the qualifying requirements, please give us a call in HR and we can look at really what other potential routes there might be, so that that person can have a period of leave off as well. So that is the world of paternity leave. We're going to go into adoption leave. Now, what you're going to start to find with adoption leave is a lot of mirroring with maternity, but you are also going to see some deviation because by very nature, adoption is very different in terms of their own process externally. So the external process then comes into the internal organisational process. But essentially, it's still a day one right, regardless of your length of service, you have entitlement to 52 weeks leave. As I was touching upon when we started talking about paternity leave, there is a fundamental question about choosing which partner is the primary adopter. So the primary adopter will have the full entitlement to the adoption leave, very similar to the maternity leave scenario. Obviously, those that are not can apply for paternity leave or shared parental leave as well. We'll talk about shared parental leave as well, subject to eligibility. So that's a key aspect of this. The primary adopter can take time off for up to 5 appointments, and the secondary adopter, the partner, can take up to 2 paid adoption appointments as well. And that's to help with obviously the process that would happen externally as well. Employees must notify the university within 7 days of being notified that they've been matched with a child for adoption. So it's that early prompt communication. But equally as well, there needs to be the application form for adoption leave as well. And really, we kind of say 28 days or as reasonably practicable. We are aware that with adoption leave, sometimes the external process can go in a slightly delayed way, which is why I think there's more caveats built into the legal requirements here, which is slightly different to maternity leave. HR again will write out and they'll confirm the framework built around that. So in terms of the dates, the maximum dates, what they've said, possibly dipping into comments on annual leave, return dates, and essentially, adoption leave can commence at any time from 14 days before the child is placed for adoption as well. And I think tailoring on from that as well, there is a lot more that we can talk around adoption leave, but what I've tried to do is just keep to the headlines because there is, similar to shared parental leave, there's some added layers of complexity. But essentially, the same things apply with regards to annual leave. So again, it's about talking about how does that fit into the equation. In some scenarios, the dates might fit quite well, and it may well be that there is opportunity to take leave either prior or at the end of the adoption leave period. But if it isn't, then obviously there's a discussion about really potentially how much might be carried over, because obviously it goes beyond the 5 days. So that's something to think about both operationally, but also from a duty of care for that individual possibly wanting some additional time off. So there are rules. I'm not going to go heavily into this second paragraph because if I'm honest, it confuses me as much as anything else. But obviously what that's intending to say is that there may be scenarios whereby, the placement doesn't take place or that it ends during that period. So there are rules in place with how that affects pay. So obviously I'm not going to talk about that kind of expressly, but there are obviously caveats written in with regards to actually what does that mean in terms of the leave and therefore in terms of the pay and how that might be addressed. Certainly for those similar to maternity, for those that have been employed for the 26 weeks, will have entitlement to either ordinary or statutory adoption pay depending on your contract and also what's written into the policy as well. I don't know, interestingly, whether there's an adoption allowance, and I will make a note of that, because as I'm talking, I'm suddenly thinking if there is, and there quite possibly is there. So I will go back and check that, but I'm sure there probably is, because generally there's complete parity with maternity to a large extent. Similarly, keep in touch days, it's the same process, because equally that person's having a period of leave that, and it may well be that they want to return to work and dip into work in whatever capacity during that period. Again, there is the opportunity to vary the return to work date, and again, there is the potential that the university may seek to recoup occupational elements of the adoption pay if that person doesn't return to work or continue for at least 3 months. And that is the world of adoption leave there. So I'm going to move forward now to talk about parental leave. Now, parental leave, interestingly, I suspect, and I could be totally wrong, is not very, very well understood or known about generally within the world of work. It's certainly not utilised. So whether that's because of lack of awareness or whether it's because it has unpaid leave aspects into this, I'm not sure. But essentially, really, anyone who is the birth or adopted parent or the parent of a child born to a surrogate, so that could equally apply, or the partner of the child or the baby's parent. If you've been continuously employed by the university and you fit into those categories for at least a year, you have entitlement to 18 weeks unpaid leave up until that child's 18th birthday. Obviously, there's a maximum, and that's in respect of each individual child. There is a maximum of 4 weeks per year, and it needs to be taken in week blocks unless this is to care for a child with a disability, and we do recognise that that could be in multiples of a day, dependent and on the specific needs that may arise around the child. There is an application process for this as well, in terms of at least 21 days prior, needs to be signed by the manager, as it would for adoption leave, as it would for maternity and paternity. That has to have the line manager's consent. It can be postponed, so a manager can postpone the leave, but obviously they have to justify that on operational reasons and explain that to the individual. But equally as well, there is a time limit on that. So really, the equivalent, a period of leave, has to be able to be taken no later than 6 months from the original date requested. And actually, if there's a request for leave immediately following the birth or adoption of a child, that has to be granted, so it wouldn't be postponed. But interestingly, it's something that we don't really see coming through, but I felt it was important to share that with you, because technically it is a source of leave, and may well be of benefit to individuals, even perhaps on an ad hoc basis. So I felt obviously it's worth actually mentioning and making sure there's that awareness there. Lastly, I'm going to talk about shared parental leave. For those of you that have ever spoken to me with me or HR generally about shared parental leave, this is quite a complex area. So HR practitioners tend to get quite slightly twitching in this because it's quite complex in the sense of the process, but it is an important entitlement, and it has significant value as well. It's just a lot more complex because of the different scenarios that may interplay. Deliberately on that basis, there's a lot more that goes on with shared parental leave here, but I've really kept to the main headlines, because I think any situation perhaps where any of you as an individual are seeking shared parental leave or just want to explore it, or perhaps as a manager that you've been asked about this, please just give us a call in HR and we can have a more extensive discussion here. But shared parental leave really is prompted by one thing. So what would happen is the primary adopter or the primary parent on maternity leave would end their maternity or adoption leave early, so that they're ending it earlier than the 52 weeks. Now, what that means is that we've got a whole stack of untaken weeks. Now, where shared parental leave comes into the equation is that the primary adopter or the primary person on maternity leave and the secondary adopter and maternity leave, who would predominantly be on paternity leave perhaps as well, have a choice. And what they can do is share out the remainder of those 52 weeks. So that could be both taking it at the same time, or it could well be that an individual takes one block. So an individual takes their block of maternity leave, and what happens is they share the remainder with their partner and they take the remaining block. Or what can also happen is you chop and change. So what's happening is the individual, so if I take maternity leave classically, the maternity leave is ended, and the individual and their partner then start to dip in and share the leave between them. So it could be in multiple blocks as well. So what that also, just to mention on the back of that, which is also important, is that that does not remove the right to paternity leave. So shared parental leave will not remove the right to 2 weeks paternity leave. It's in addition to. So I started to talk about the patterns, and there are definitions of this, and this is where the jargon can get a bit complicated, but essentially we can an employee can request a single block, and that's called continuous leave. That would be granted. So there is an expectation that that will be granted. So typically that might be, I'm ending maternity, so I'm ending my maternity leave after 6 months, 9 months, whatever it might be, and my partner's going to take the remainder. Alternatively, there might be a request for a discontinuous pattern of leave. Now, discontinuous pattern talks about those other combinations that we're talking about. They need to be granted and they need to be approved by the manager. So what that means is that there may, in the application form, that application form is obviously going to be a lot more extensive than what you may have ever seen with a maternity and adoption application, because by the very nature, it's talking about potentially a whole number of different leave arrangements that might be asked for. Now, leave must not be less than 1 week unless you're part-time, because obviously if you're part-time, your week is obviously going to be proportionally less. The other factor that plays into this as well is that a number of combinations may happen here. So it may well be that both the primary birth parent and the adopter and partner work for the university. That's probably much more straightforward, and certainly from a HR perspective, much more straightforward because we control everything then. But it could well be that the birth parent or primary adopter or partner could be employed elsewhere. So what that means is that we will, as part of the application form, we may need to speak to the other employer as well. So there is an added aspect there. Shared parental leave typically has been used before. It's not very common, but it has been used before. But generally where it has been used, it's just been 2 blocks. And that tends to be the preference for whatever reason around that. The other aspect I just wanted to add to this as well, obviously I've just covered about the application process there. There is an aspect around the entitlement to statutory shared parental leave pay. So there's a difference here. So maternity pay is not necessarily the same thing as shared parental leave pay. So this is where it's really important that it's very, very clear on when somebody's actually saying, I am ending my maternity, because that also affects the pay. Because when an individual seeks to commence shared parental leave, then it's shared parental leave pay. That follows the statutory entitlement, but also there's the qualifying service that's required, where it goes back to that lovely 26 weeks before the 15th week before the expected week of confinement, or due date as it is, or the matching date, and having the average weekly earnings that mirror the national insurance requirements on the back of it. So there is also a requirement in terms of, if you are undertaking shared parental leave, to be paid shared parental leave. There are additional qualifying needs there as well. Similar to maternity leave, similar to adoption leave, you've also got your 20 kit days going on. Absolutely same rules. Obviously, if we've got individuals that are working for another organisation as well, they will control that. So as a manager, as a HR department as well, we will only be liaising with an employee on things like kit days for those that we employ. In terms of our talking to other employers, it's very much about confirming that what we understand is what they understand too. So that's where the contact with another employer may kick in. But again, shared parental leave is something that typically hasn't come to the forefront, but is starting to increasingly be inquired I think about as well. So I think as an employee, both in terms of individual entitlements and options, but also as a manager in terms of questions that you may have, it's important obviously to have that understanding of what that's all about. Now, I'm going to stop sharing completely now and just bring you all back on screen there as well. That fundamentally was the essence of the session that I wanted to cover with you today. We're 5 minutes ahead of schedule as well. We do have an opportunity for questions. So there are options here in terms of whether there's anything you wanted to ask or comment on now, or equally if you want to drop me a line, and obviously we can have a chat separately as well. So I'm going to pause. And so obviously I don't know if this is going to be a tumbleweed moment or whether there's going to be lots of questions, but I'm going to pause now and just allow anyone to come off mute. You don't have to raise your hand, just come off mute and just ask me anything that you want to. This is where it goes either very quiet or not, I think probably.
Hi, Stacey.
Hi.
No questions, but I just wanted to say thank you very much. But there's a lot to remember.
There is.
It's quite complex, and obviously we'll still come to our HRBPs with specific questions when we need. Is that still okay? Yeah.
Absolutely, and that goes without saying. I think across the whole domain, and of course, absolutely across the whole domain, but particularly as well with some of the lesser used kind of entitlements as well. It's that classic, isn't it? If you don't use it, your memory goes on to something else, doesn't it? It's that classic thing, isn't it? It's the same for our department as well. You know, certain things are going to resonate. So maternity probably more classically is going to resonate with a lot more people. Not everyone, because not everybody would have had that kind of exposure to questions around that. But certainly, you know, across the board, particularly with some of the other areas. So, and I'm going to obviously, we'll put this on the intranet as well, but absolutely, you know, please contact me for questions. That's a really, really helpful point, Jo. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks.
Thank you. Kirsty.
Just from a mum point of view, I'm not a manager or anything, but obviously you don't get enough holidays for all of the children's school leave. So how do you do the shared parental leave? Is it just a form we need to fill out if it is something we're struggling with childcare?
Yeah, so shared parental leave is obviously dipping into what would have been the full 12 months maternity leave.
No, so it's not that one I mean, it's the unpaid one.
Oh, the parental leave. So the parental leave.
So that's never been really mentioned before, but I know 6 weeks of summer, you haven't got enough holidays yourself to take every school holiday off. So what form would you fill in if you were struggling?
So there is, so it's interesting that you've said that, because that kind of mirrors with what my observation was. And I suspect that probably that entitlement's just not very well known about at all, which is interesting what you've just said though, because that was my sense around that. There will be an application, and what I can do as well obviously is share with you the link, because obviously within our intranet, well, there's two methods of doing that. So on our intranet you can go straight to an A to Z, so you'll see an A to Z section and just click on that and it will zoom you through. So if you go on to kind of P, it should start to kind of bring up paternity, parentally. But I think we also have a category which says family friendly policies as well, so you can kind of go through that mechanism. There will be applications for every single mechanism. I will double check, Kirsty, but I'm pretty sure there will be an application for that as well, process for that, similar to kind of the other areas. And I think the first starting point is obviously that discussion with the line manager, filling in that application form and getting that through.
Okay.
I think because it may well be, as you identify, that there are, particularly perhaps during the summer months, there are times where actually that may well be a beneficial thing to have. So absolutely something to explore. That's why it's there. You know, so definitely consider that. Definitely consider that as part of the annual leave cycle there. I can see some chat comments, but before I just move on to the chat comments, is there anybody that wanted to kind of ask me anything verbally or comment on anything? Any observations on the beautiful law, I guess, really? I think now things may change. Just to also mention on this, things could change. Obviously, we've got a new government. And the government is reviewing the whole lot at the moment. So it may well be that things start to evolve again around that. So, but obviously, as we currently are right now, obviously, you know, we have the framework, but it could evolve again. I'm just going to check the chat messages just to make sure that I haven't missed anything on there. Okay. Yes, absolutely. So I think there's a few comments on the parental leave that are coming through at the moment, which is a really interesting and important point as well. And maybe that's something that I need to take back to our department as well, in terms of obviously just ensuring that we are promoting certain aspects more fully if there is less awareness of certain situations and certain entitlements that may be beneficial there. But unless anybody's got any further questions there, we'll end it there. And I just want to say a huge thank you for your time. Thank you so much for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. Oh, Sanar, you wanted to ask something. If anybody wants to leave now, that's absolutely fine. But Sanar, I'll stay on the line and have a chat with you.